You are currently a puppet of the social machinery, living through a mask that isn't yours. A puppet, strings you didn't choose, pulling a version of you that was built by everyone except you. What if the only way to find your true power is to disappear completely? Because we are not talking about hiding today. We are talking about hunting. By weaponizing Jungian withdrawal, we are going after the darkest, most buried parts of yourself, on purpose, until you claim absolute authority over who you become. Here's the part that will make you uncomfortable. Carl Jung gave a name to the mask you're wearing right now. He called it the persona. It was built for one reason: to keep you accepted, to keep you approved of, to keep you safe inside the group. But a mask built for safety was never built for power. And that mask has been running your entire life, while the real you sits buried, untouched, forgotten, silent. So ask yourself the one question almost nobody survives asking. If the mask came off right now, completely, permanently, who would actually be left standing? Silence. That's the answer. A void. And that void terrifies most people more than anything else on earth. So they never ask. They keep the mask on. They keep performing forever. But there is a way through that void. Jung called it withdrawal. Total, deliberate, merciless. A complete retreat from every borrowed identity, every voice that was never yours, until the silence cracks open and something ancient finally speaks. We are not calling this rest. We are not calling this healing. This is an extraction, strategic extraction. You are ripping your power back from everything that has been quietly feeding on it, and you are returning it to the only place it ever belonged, you. Behind that void waits something Jung named the shadow. Every desire you buried alive, every instinct you strangled because it was too much. That is not shame sitting in there. That is fuel, raw, untouched, waiting. In the next few minutes you are going to watch the mask tear apart, piece by piece. You are going to watch the shadow rise to the surface. And you are going to watch a sovereign individual get built from what's left standing. If you are ready to meet what's underneath, drop this in the comments right now. I claim my shadow. Say it if you mean it. Because by the end of this video, you will not be the same person who started it. Lesson 1. The digital parasite and the death of identity. Every single day your mind gets pulled in 100 directions before you even sit up in bed. Notifications, noise, endless streams of information fighting for a piece of your attention. This is not an accident. This is the environment you live in now, in 2026, and it was built to keep your focus scattered, your thoughts shallow, and your identity borrowed from whatever is loudest in the moment. Carl Jung never lived to see this world, but he understood the mechanism behind it perfectly. He called it the persona. The persona is the mask you present to the outside. It gets you through crowds, through strangers, through unfamiliar rooms. But the danger is not that the mask exists. The danger is what happens when the mask becomes permanent, when you forget you ever had a face underneath it. Think about how much of your day is spent reacting instead of choosing. Something pulls your attention, and you respond. Another thing pulls it again, and you respond again. Hour after hour, your energy leaks out into 1,000 tiny reactions, and none of it comes back to you. This is what I call the digital parasite. It does not look like a threat because it feels normal. It feels like just living. But underneath that normal feeling is a slow drain, a quiet theft. Every reaction is a small piece of your identity, spent and gone. Here is the part almost nobody wants to admit. The persona was never meant to be your entire self. It was meant to be a tool, a costume you put on for specific situations and take off when you no longer need it. But hyperstimulation never lets you take it off. There is always another distraction demanding a response, another piece of noise asking for your face, your reaction, your energy. So the mask stays on, day after day, until you cannot remember what it felt like to exist without performing something. This is the death of identity, not a dramatic collapse, a quiet fading. You stop noticing the difference between what you actually want and what the noise around you has trained you to want. Your preferences start to feel borrowed. Your reactions start to feel automatic. You are still moving, still functioning, still getting through each day, but the driver behind the wheel is no longer you. It is the accumulated weight of everything you have absorbed without questioning it. I want you to sit with a hard question for a moment. When was the last time you made a decision that came purely from inside you, with no outside influence shaping it at all? Not a decision based on what looked right, or what felt expected, or what avoided discomfort. A decision that came from something deep and unfiltered. If you cannot answer that quickly, you already understand the problem I am describing. This is why the first move toward real power has nothing to do with adding more information, more input, more noise. The first move is subtraction. We call this the strategic extraction, and it is not gentle. It requires you to pull your energy back from every place it has been leaking, one deliberate cut at a time. You stop feeding the parasite. You stop offering your attention as fuel for a system that gives nothing back. Strategic extraction begins with awareness. You have to notice the pattern before you can break it. Notice how often your mind reaches outward for stimulation instead of resting inward. Notice how uncomfortable silence feels when there is no noise to fill it. That discomfort is not a flaw in you. It is proof of how deep the conditioning goes. The parasite has been feeding for years, and it will not let go without resistance. But resistance is exactly what separates the puppet from the sovereign individual. The puppet reacts. The sovereign individual chooses. And the only way to learn the difference between those two states is to remove the noise completely, even if only for a short window of time, and observe what rises when nothing outside is pulling your strings anymore. Consider how strange it is that silence feels harder to sit inside than constant stimulation. That single fact tells you everything about how deep this conditioning runs. A mind trained on endless input starts treating quiet like a threat instead of a resting place. But quiet is not the enemy here. Quiet is simply unfamiliar territory, and unfamiliar territory always feels uncomfortable before it feels natural. This is where our path begins, not with more effort thrown into the noise, with a full, deliberate retreat from it. In the next section, we go deeper into exactly how that retreat works, and why absolute solitude is not punishment. It is a laboratory. If this idea already feels true in your chest, drop this in the comments right now. I refuse to leak my energy. Say it if you mean it, because the next section is where the real work begins. Lesson 2. The mechanics of calculated withdrawal. Most people hear the word solitude and picture something sad. A person alone in a quiet room, cut off, missing out, wasting time that could be spent with others. That picture is wrong, and it is wrong on purpose. It was planted in your mind, so you would never choose stillness voluntarily. So you would always associate silence with lack, and noise with life. I want to offer you a different picture. Absolute solitude is not an empty room. It is a laboratory, a controlled environment where every distraction has been removed, so you can observe something that never gets to surface under normal conditions. your own raw psychology, without a single outside variable interfering with the results. Jung understood this better than almost anyone in his field. He spent long stretches of his own life in deliberate withdrawal, away from patients, away from colleagues, away from the constant pull of professional expectation. He did not do this because he was tired. He did this because he knew that certain truths about the psyche only reveal themselves in conditions of total quiet. You cannot study a reaction while you are still reacting. You have to stop the noise completely to see what was hiding underneath it. So what does calculated withdrawal actually look like in practice? It is not a vague suggestion to relax more. It is a structured process with stages, and each stage brings its own resistance. The first stage is the stripping of external validation. This means removing the things you unconsciously use to measure your own worth against the outside world. Praise, comparison, approval, recognition. All of it gets set aside, deliberately and completely for a defined period. This sounds simple until you try it. Within a very short time, most people feel a strange kind of panic, a sense that something important is missing, even though nothing physical has changed. That panic is the mask cracking. It is proof that a large part of your sense of self was built entirely on outside approval, propped up like scaffolding around a building with no foundation underneath. The second stage is what I call the void encounter. Once the external props are gone, there is a gap, a silence with nothing filling it. Most people run from this gap the moment they feel it. They reach for anything, any distraction, any noise, just to avoid sitting inside that emptiness for more than a few seconds. This is why the first stretch of real solitude feels almost unbearable. Your hand reaches for a phone that isn't there. Your mind manufactures a task that doesn't need doing. That reaching is not weakness. It is a lifetime of habit trying to protect you from a space it has never once been allowed to sit inside. But the void is not dangerous. It only feels dangerous because you have spent your entire life avoiding it. The void is simply the space where your borrowed identity used to stand before you removed all the borrowed pieces. The third stage is the anxiety of losing control. This is the part nobody warns you about, and it is the part that makes most people quit before they get anywhere near real transformation. When the ego stops receiving its usual stream of external feedback, it panics. It starts generating fear, doubt, restlessness, even physical discomfort. This is not a sign that something has gone wrong. It is a sign that the ego is losing its grip on the environment it used to control through constant performance. Let that anxiety exist without feeding it. Do not run back to noise the moment it appears. The ego will settle once it understands there is no threat, only unfamiliar quiet. Here is something crucial to understand about this entire process. Calculated withdrawal is not permanent isolation from existence. It is a deliberate, temporary shutdown of input, so that output stops being automatic and starts being chosen. Think of it as clearing static off a signal. You are not destroying the signal. You are removing everything that was distorting it. Once you move through these three stages, stripping, void, and anxiety, something begins to shift. The mind stops scrambling for external noise to fill the silence. It starts to settle into the quiet instead of fighting it. And in that settled quiet, something else begins to surface. Something that has been waiting a very long time to be acknowledged directly instead of suppressed. There is one more detail worth understanding before we move forward. The ego rarely surrenders control quietly, even once it stops panicking outright. Expect small waves of resistance even after the initial anxiety fades, moments where the mind reaches for old habits, out of pure muscle memory. You might catch yourself humming a jingle from a commercial, replaying an old argument, or inventing a reason to check something that does not need checking. None of that means the withdrawal failed. It means the mind is doing what minds do when the usual stream of input goes quiet, filling the gap with whatever scraps of old material it still has lying around. This is normal. It does not mean the process failed. It simply means old wiring takes time to loosen fully, and patience here matters more than force. That something is what we confront next, and it is not comfortable. It is not supposed to be. If you can already feel that scaffolding starting to loosen, drop this in the comments right now. I choose the quiet over the noise. Lesson 3. Confronting the weight of the shadow. Once the noise stops and the void has been sat with long enough, something rises that most people spend their entire life avoiding. Jung called it the shadow, and it is exactly what it sounds like. Every part of you that got pushed into darkness because it was inconvenient, unacceptable, or simply too intense for the world you grew up in. The shadow is not evil. This point gets misunderstood constantly, so let me be direct about it. The shadow is not a demon living inside you waiting to destroy your life. The shadow is simply everything you were taught to reject about yourself. Anger you were told to swallow. Ambition you were told was too much. Desire you were told was shameful. Instinct you were told to override with politeness. None of these things are inherently destructive. They only become destructive when they are buried alive and left to rot in the dark, without ever being examined. Here is what happens in absolute solitude that cannot happen anywhere else. Without outside distraction pulling your attention elsewhere, the shadow finally gets the space it needs to surface. And when it does, most people do something predictable. They project it. Instead of recognizing a buried instinct as their own, they see it reflected everywhere else instead, in situations, in circumstances, in the world around them. This is moral projection, and it is one of the oldest tricks the mind plays on itself. It is far easier to see your own darkness reflected outward than to admit it lives inside you. Isolation removes that escape route. When there is nothing outside to project onto, the shadow has nowhere left to hide except in plain sight, right in front of you. This is the exact moment most people quit the entire process. Facing your own buried instincts without an external target to blame is one of the most uncomfortable experiences a person can have. But it is also the only path toward real integration. You cannot integrate what you refuse to look at directly. This is where shadow dialogue begins. Shadow dialogue is not a metaphor, and it is not a gentle suggestion. It is an active, deliberate conversation with the parts of yourself you have spent your entire life suppressing. You stop running from the anger and instead ask it what it actually wants. You stop drowning the ambition in guilt and instead ask it what it is trying to build. You stop shaming the desire and instead ask it what unmet need it is pointing toward. This process feels strange at first because you are essentially negotiating with pieces of your own psyche as though they were separate entities. In a sense, they are. Years of suppression turn buried instincts into something that behaves almost autonomously, surfacing at unexpected moments, driving reactions you do not fully understand. Shadow dialogue brings those fragmented pieces back into direct communication with your conscious awareness, instead of letting them operate in the background, unseen and unmanaged. The danger in this stage is not the shadow itself. The danger is turning away from it the moment it becomes uncomfortable. Most people faced with their own buried instincts immediately reach for shame. They label what they find as proof that something is fundamentally wrong with them. This reaction guarantees the shadow stays buried, festering quietly, resurfacing later in ways that are far harder to control. Shame does not integrate anything. Shame only pushes the material back into hiding, deeper than before. The alternative to shame is ownership without judgment. You look directly at the instinct, the desire, the anger, whatever has surfaced, and you acknowledge it as a real part of your own psychology, without immediately deciding it is good or bad. This is harder than it sounds because the instinct to judge is almost automatic. But judgment closes the conversation before it can start. Ownership keeps it open. As shadow dialogue continues, something begins to change in how these buried instincts feel. The intensity that once felt dangerous starts to feel more like raw material, unshaped but usable. Anger becomes drive. Ambition becomes direction. Desire becomes clarity about what you actually want instead of what you were told to want. None of this happens instantly. It happens through repeated, honest confrontation, session after session, until the shadow stops feeling like an enemy hiding in the dark and starts feeling like an untapped resource you finally have access to. One more thing worth naming clearly. This confrontation is rarely a single moment of revelation. It usually comes in waves, one buried instinct surfacing, being acknowledged, settling, and then another rising behind it. Do not expect a single dramatic breakthrough that resolves everything at once. Expect layers, each one a little deeper than the last, each one requiring the same honest ownership before it can settle. This shift from shame to ownership, from suppression to dialogue, is the turning point of the entire process. Once you reach it, you are ready for the next stage, where all of this raw material gets forged into something usable. If you can feel that shift starting to happen inside you, drop this in the comments right now. I own what I buried. Lesson 4. Integrating raw power into personal authority. Everything up to this point has been about facing what was buried. This section is about doing something with it. A shadow that has been acknowledged but never integrated is still just a shadow, quieter maybe, less likely to surprise you, but still separate from the rest of your psyche instead of woven into it. Integration is the process of taking that raw material and fusing it with the conscious self until the two stop functioning as opposites and start functioning as one complete structure. Jung called this fusion the path toward the self, distinct from the ego. The ego is the part of you that manages daily function, decisions, reactions, the surface-level operator. The self is something larger, a full integration of conscious and unconscious material into a single coherent identity. Most people live their entire lives operating purely from ego, cut off from the deeper material that could give their identity actual weight and stability. Integration is how you close that gap. Here is the practical shift that happens once integration begins. Instinct that used to feel shameful starts to feel like fuel instead. Anger that used to feel dangerous starts to feel like clarity about where your boundaries actually are. Desire that used to feel embarrassing starts to feel like direction about what you are genuinely building toward. None of these instincts disappear. They transform, because they finally have a conscious structure to move through instead of operating unmanaged in the background. This transformation creates something I call the centered self. The centered self is not a personality type. It is a state of internal stability that does not depend on outside circumstances to hold together. Before integration, identity is fragile because it depends heavily on validation, comparison, and constant management of the mask presented to the world. After integration, identity holds its own weight because both the light and dark material inside you have been acknowledged, examined, and fused into a single, functioning structure instead of two competing forces pulling in opposite directions. One of the clearest signs that integration is happening is a change in how rejection feels. Before this work, rejection or disapproval can feel like a direct threat to your entire sense of self, because so much of that self was built on external approval in the first place. After integration, rejection still exists, disapproval still happens, but it stops threatening the core structure underneath. The centered self does not need universal approval to remain stable. It has its own foundation now, built from material that came entirely from within, instead of borrowed from outside expectation. This does not mean you become indifferent to everyone around you. That would be a misunderstanding of what integration actually produces. What changes is the source of your stability. Before, stability came from constant external maintenance, careful performance, endless adjustment to avoid disapproval. After, stability comes from an internal structure that does not require that maintenance anymore. You can still care about people, still engage with the world, still build relationships and pursue goals, but none of it is propping up a fragile identity anymore. It is simply part of a life being lived by someone who already knows who they are. There is a shift in behavior that naturally follows this internal change. Before integration, most people function as reactive participants, responding to whatever circumstance or expectation shows up in front of them, shaped constantly by outside pressure. After integration, that reactive pattern starts to fade, replaced by something closer to authorship. You begin making decisions based on an internal compass instead of external pressure. You begin building a direction for your life instead of simply reacting to whatever direction gets thrust upon you by circumstance. This shift from reaction to authorship does not happen overnight. It builds gradually through repeated practice of choosing from the integrated self instead of the fragmented ego. You will notice it first in small moments, a pause before you respond to criticism instead of an automatic flinch, a decision made because it fits your own direction instead of because it avoids someone else's disapproval. Those small moments are the actual evidence that the self is now driving instead of the old, borrowed script. The raw power that once felt dangerous, buried in the dark corners of your psyche, has now become the exact material your personal authority is built from. Nothing was wasted. Nothing needed to be destroyed. It only needed to be faced directly and given a conscious structure to move through. It helps to remember that integration is not a fixed destination you arrive at once and never revisit. It behaves more like a muscle. Left unused, it weakens. Practiced consistently, it grows stronger and steadier over time. The fusion of light and dark material inside you is not a one-time event finished after a single session of solitude. It is an ongoing relationship between the conscious mind and everything it once tried to bury. What remains now is learning how to carry this integration back into daily existence without losing it. And that is exactly where we go next. If you feel that internal foundation solidifying, drop this in the comments. I am building my own direction. Lesson 5. The return of the sovereign individual. Every process of withdrawal eventually has to end, at least temporarily. And this is the stage most people get wrong. They assume the goal was permanent isolation, a complete departure from ordinary existence. That was never the point. The point of absolute solitude was never to stay hidden forever. It was to build something strong enough to survive re-entry without collapsing back into the same fragmented patterns you started with. This stage requires a protocol, not just good intentions. Good intentions dissolve quickly once ordinary life resumes, and old patterns start pulling at familiar habits. A protocol gives you structure to fall back on when the pull toward old behavior gets strong. The first part of this protocol is recognizing the difference between engagement and absorption. Engagement means participating in ordinary existence while remaining anchored to the integrated self you built during withdrawal. Absorption means slowly losing that anchor, getting pulled back into reactive patterns until the mask returns without you noticing. The goal is engagement without absorption, staying present and active in your daily life while remaining rooted in the internal foundation you built. The second part of this protocol involves what I call the unshakable foundation. This foundation is built from everything covered so far: the stripping of external validation, the confrontation with the void, the ownership of the shadow, and the fusion of raw instinct into the centered self. Once built, this foundation does not require constant external reinforcement to remain stable. It holds its own weight. This means you can move through ordinary existence, interact with others, participate fully in daily life, without needing to rebuild a false mask just to feel secure. The mask becomes optional now instead of mandatory. You can choose to present a certain face in a certain moment without losing yourself underneath it, because there is a real self underneath it now, solid enough to hold steady, regardless of the face you choose to show. This distinction matters enormously. Before this process, the mask was mandatory because there was nothing solid underneath it to fall back on. After this process, the mask becomes a tool you use deliberately, when useful, instead of a permanent covering you cannot remove. That shift from mandatory mask to optional tool is one of the clearest markers that integration has actually taken root instead of remaining theoretical. The third part of this protocol is the most important, and it is the part most people skip entirely once they start feeling better. This work is not a single event. It is a cycle. The pressures of ordinary existence do not disappear once you return from withdrawal. Over time, without maintenance, old patterns can quietly creep back in, the same way dust settles on a clean surface if nobody wipes it down. This is why a recurring withdrawal cycle matters. Not a single retreat you complete once and never revisit. A repeated practice built into your existence permanently, where you periodically strip away the noise again, check in with the shadow again, and reinforce the centered self again before old patterns have a chance to fully take hold. Think of this cycle the same way you would think about maintaining anything valuable over a long period of time. A single deep cleaning does not keep a space permanently spotless. It requires ongoing attention. The same is true for psychological sovereignty. A single withdrawal, no matter how intense or transformative, does not guarantee permanent immunity from fragmentation. It requires a recurring practice, a rhythm of retreat and return, solitude and engagement, quiet and presence, repeated deliberately over the course of an entire life. This is what separates temporary insight from lasting transformation. Plenty of people experience a brief moment of clarity, a single powerful realization about their own shadow or their own persona, and then slowly drift back into old patterns because they never built the recurring structure needed to maintain what they discovered. Real sovereignty is not a single event you complete and move past. It is a practice you return to again and again, deliberately for the rest of your existence. One final piece belongs here before we close this section. Sovereignty built through this process is not loud. It does not announce itself through arrogance or constant display. It shows up quietly in the steadiness of your reactions, in the calm underneath moments that used to shake you, in the simple fact that your sense of self no longer depends on anything outside your own foundation. That quiet steadiness is the clearest proof the work is real. You now understand what most people will never take the time to face directly. The mask you wear is optional, not mandatory. The shadow you carry is fuel, not shame. And the silence you have been avoiding your entire life is not empty. It is the exact place where your real identity has been waiting the entire time, patient, unshaken, ready to be claimed the moment you finally stop running from it. If this entire process has shifted something inside you, drop this in the comments. I return to myself. Everything we walked through today comes down to one simple truth. The mask was never really you, the noise was never really necessary, and the darkest parts of yourself were never something to be ashamed of. They were raw material waiting for the right conditions to be shaped into something powerful. You started this video wearing a costume built by circumstance, by pressure, by years of learning what was acceptable to show and what had to stay hidden. If you followed this process with honesty, even just in your mind while watching, you already understand that the costume is optional now. It was always optional. Most people simply never take the time to discover that for themselves. The path forward is not complicated, even though it is not easy. Strip away the noise. Sit inside the silence long enough to meet what has been buried. Stop running from the shadow and start negotiating with it directly. Fuse the raw and the conscious into a single stable structure. Return to ordinary existence carrying that structure with you instead of leaving it behind in the quiet. And repeat the entire cycle again and again for as long as you are alive, because sovereignty is not a single achievement. It is a practice. This channel exists to keep walking this exact path with you, deeper each time, further each time, past the surface level advice that never actually changes anything real, and into the true mechanics of how the psyche builds lasting inner strength. If today's process meant something to you, if even one part of it landed and made you look at yourself differently, do 3 things right now before you move on with your day. Like this video so more people who need exactly this message have a real chance to find it when they need it most. Share it with someone you know who's still stuck wearing a mask they forgot how to remove a long time ago. Subscribe to this channel right now, because this is only the very beginning of a much deeper path, and the next video takes this even further. Before you go, drop this final line in the comments one more time, so it stays with you long after this video ends. I choose the quiet over the noise. I own what I buried. I return to myself. This was never meant to be entertainment you consume once and forget. It was meant to be a starting point, a door left open for you to walk through again whenever life pulls you back into old patterns. Come back to this whenever the old mask starts feeling permanent again. Come back whenever the noise starts feeling normal again. The door stays open. Say it if you mean it, and I will see you in the next one.